Meet the man who inspired one of television's most chilling characters, a real-life serial killer who targeted only the guilty. This isn't a story plucked from the twisted imagination of a Hollywood screenwriter. It's the dark, disturbing reality of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man who redefined what it means to blur the lines between justice and vigilantism. In a world where justice is often elusive, Filho took it upon himself to administer his own brand of lethal retribution, becoming a grim reaper for those who had slipped through the cracks of the legal system. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known infamously as Pedrinho Matador or simply Killer Petey, is not a household name, yet his story mirrors the fictional Dexter Morgan in ways that are both fascinating and terrifying. Dexter Morgan, the iconic character from the television series Dexter, is portrayed as a forensic expert by day and a vigilante serial killer by night, meticulously targeting only those who deserve to die, criminals who have escaped justice. Pedro, however, was no fictional anti-hero. He was a real man who embarked on a killing spree that would eventually claim the lives of over 70 individuals, all of whom he believed were guilty of heinous crimes. But unlike Dexter, whose killings are calculated and methodical, Pedro's life was marred by violence and tragedy from the very beginning. Born with a damaged skull after his father brutally beat his pregnant mother, Pedro's path seemed almost predestined. His first kill came at the tender age of 14, when he murdered the vice mayor of Alfinas in a fit of rage for firing his father. This act of violence set the stage for a life dominated by bloodshed. By the time he reached adulthood, Pedro had become a notorious figure in Brazil, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of those who knew of his deeds. What makes Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story so compelling and so deeply unsettling is the rationale behind his killings. Much like Dexter, Pedro claimed to be driven by a moral code. He didn't kill indiscriminately, he targeted those he believed were beyond redemption. Drug dealers, murderers, and rapists, these were his chosen victims. In his mind, he was ridding the world of its filth, delivering the kind of justice that the legal system failed to provide. It's this twisted sense of morality that makes Pedro's story so captivating, as it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the human capacity for violence. But Pedro's story doesn't end there. Unlike the fictional Dexter, who operated in the shadows, Pedro's crimes were anything but secret. He was eventually captured and sentenced to an astonishing 400 years in prison, though Brazilian law capped his actual time served at 30 years. Even behind bars, Pedro continued his killing spree, murdering over 40 inmates, each one a criminal in his eyes. His actions in prison only solidified his reputation as a man who was relentless in his pursuit of justice, even if that justice came at the cost of his own humanity. As we dive deeper into the life of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, the real-life Dexter, we'll explore the events that shaped him, the crimes that defined him, and the legacy he left behind. This is not just the story of a man who killed, it's the story of a man who believed he was right to do so, a man who lived and died by a code that placed him somewhere between hero and villain. By the end of this journey, we'll not only understand the man behind the murders, but we'll also be forced to confront the darker side of justice and the fine line that separates it from revenge. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life seemed doomed from the very start, his path to becoming one of Brazil's most notorious killers almost predestined by the violence that surrounded his birth. Born on July 17, 1954, in the Brazilian town of Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Pedro's early life was marred by brutality before he even took his first breath. His father, a violent and abusive man, dealt a savage blow to Pedro's pregnant mother during an argument, striking her in the belly. This attack left the unborn Pedro with a damaged skull, a physical reminder of the violence that would follow him throughout his life. From his very first moments, the seeds of violence were sown deep within him. Growing up in a household dominated by fear and aggression, Pedro's childhood was anything but normal. His father was an unstable man, known for his violent outbursts, particularly against Pedro's mother. This toxic environment was where Pedro's understanding of the world began to take shape, a world where power was demonstrated through violence and where love and fear were hopelessly entangled. The constant abuse and the psychological trauma of living under such conditions undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping Pedro's psyche. The young boy, exposed to relentless brutality, began to internalize these experiences, developing a skewed sense of morality that would later justify his actions. The catalyst for Pedro's descent into a life of crime came when he was just 14 years old. At this tender age, when most boys are preoccupied with school and play, Pedro was already grappling with dark, murderous thoughts. The first crack in his fragile innocence appeared when his father was wrongfully dismissed from his job as a school security guard by the vice mayor of the town. Pedro, fueled by a deep seated sense of injustice and a burning rage, decided to take matters into his own hands. Armed with a shotgun, the young teenager confronted the vice mayor and, without hesitation, shot him dead in cold blood. This was not just an act of revenge, it was Pedro's first taste of power, the first time he realized that he could take control in a world that had always controlled him. This initial murder was the spark that ignited Pedro's killing spree, but it was far from an isolated incident. The thrill of that first kill, combined with the twisted sense of justice that had taken root in his mind, set Pedro on a path of relentless violence. His early experiences, particularly the abuse he witnessed and endured at home, had warped his understanding of right and wrong. In Pedro's mind, the world was divided into those who deserved to live and those who deserved to die, and he saw himself as the executioner, the one who would bring balance to the scales of justice. The psychological impact of Pedro's early life cannot be understated. The abuse and violence he experienced at the hands of his father planted the seeds of anger and resentment that would grow into a full-blown psychopathy. By the time Pedro committed his first murder, he was already a deeply troubled individual, his mind twisted by years of trauma and pain. His actions were not just the result of a desire for revenge, they were the manifestation of a young boy's desperate attempt to gain control over his chaotic and violent world. As Pedro's life spiraled further into darkness, the boy who had once been a victim of his father's brutality became something far more terrifying. The combination of a traumatic childhood, the early exposure to violence, and the thrill of taking a life created a perfect storm within Pedro's mind, transforming him from a scared, abused child into a cold-blooded killer. His early experiences had taught him that violence was not only a means of survival, but a way to assert power and control, and this lesson would guide him for the rest of his life. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's transformation from a young boy scarred by violence to a notorious vigilante killer truly began when he decided to take the law into his own hands. After the murder of the vice mayor, Pedro didn't stop. In fact, that first act of violence seemed to awaken something dark within him, a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before. From this point forward, Pedro embarked on a killing spree, but unlike many other serial killers, his victims were carefully chosen. He didn't kill randomly. He targeted those he believed were guilty, those who had wronged others or posed a threat to society. In his mind, he was not just a murderer, he was a judge, jury, and executioner. The first targets of Pedro's vigilante justice were those who he believed were responsible for the death of his girlfriend, Maria Aparcida Olympia. Maria was brutally murdered by gang members, a loss that devastated Pedro and ignited a desire for revenge that would propel him into a life of crime. Consumed by rage and grief, Pedro set out on a mission to find and kill those responsible. This was not just about personal revenge, it was the beginning of a pattern that would define his life, targeting criminals whom he felt deserved to die. Pedro's next notable act of vigilante justice was against a local drug dealer. In the gritty streets of Sao Paulo, where crime was rampant and the justice system often fell short, Pedro took it upon himself to rid his community of those he deemed harmful. The drug dealer, who had long been a menace in the area, became one of Pedro's first victims. Pedro's approach was brutal and unrelenting. He tracked down the dealer and executed him without hesitation. This act solidified Pedro's self imposed role as a vigilante, a man who believed it was his duty to eliminate those who preyed on the weak. As Pedro continued his killing spree, a pattern began to emerge. Much like the fictional character Dexter Morgan, who operated under a strict code known as the Code of Harry, Pedro developed his own set of rules. Dexter's code, which was instilled in him by his adoptive father, dictated that he should only kill those who were guilty of heinous crimes, those who had escaped justice. Pedro's code was similar, though it was not taught to him by a father figure, but rather forged through his own experiences with violence and injustice. He believed that his victims had to meet a specific criterion. They had to be criminals who had somehow evaded the law. This code was Pedro's way of justifying his actions, a means of reconciling the violence he inflicted with the sense of justice he believed he was delivering. The most prolific period of Pedro's killing spree took place during his time in Sao Paulo, a city plagued by crime and corruption. It was here that Pedro's reputation as a vigilante killer truly took shape. He began targeting major criminals, including drug lords, murderers, and rapists. His methods were often brutal. Torture and execution were common tools in his quest for what he saw as justice. Yet, despite the fear he instilled, there were those who saw him as a necessary evil, a man who was doing what the police could not or would not do. In Sao Paulo, Pedro's body count grew rapidly. He became a notorious figure, both feared and, in some circles, revered. His actions attracted the attention of law enforcement, but Pedro was not easily caught. He operated with a level of cunning that made him difficult to track, always staying one step ahead of those who sought to bring him to justice. During this period, Pedro killed dozens of people, each murder reinforcing his belief that he was carrying out a higher form of justice. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's killing spree was not just the work of a deranged mind, it was the manifestation of a deeply ingrained belief system. He saw himself as a necessary force in a world where justice was often denied, a man who could do what the law could not. In his mind, his victims were not innocent, they were criminals who had earned their fate. This twisted sense of morality is what makes Pedro's story so chilling, as it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the line between hero and villain is not as clear as we might like to believe. Through his years in Sao Paulo, Pedro built a legacy of fear and violence, one that would eventually lead to his capture, but not before leaving an indelible mark on the criminal underworld. His story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of taking justice into one's own hands and the inevitable corruption of even the most righteous of intentions. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life was already a swirling storm of violence and vengeance, but the ultimate betrayal that would sever his family ties came in the most brutal and personal way possible. This moment not only deepened Pedro's already twisted sense of justice, but also marked a turning point in his life, driving him further into the abyss of violence and solidifying his identity as a killer with a cause. Pedro's father was a violent and abusive man, the source of much of the trauma that had plagued Pedro from birth. His brutality was not just directed at Pedro, but was especially severe towards Pedro's mother. For years, she endured his abuse, and this constant exposure to violence undoubtedly left deep psychological scars on young Pedro. However, the true horror came when Pedro's father escalated his abuse to the ultimate crime, the murder of Pedro's mother. The murder was nothing short of gruesome. Pedro's father attacked his wife with a machete, killing her in a fit of rage. This act was the culmination of years of domestic violence, a horrific end to a life marred by suffering. For Pedro, this was not just the loss of a mother, it was the shattering of the last vestiges of family that had already been hanging by a thread. The man who had given him life had taken away the person who had tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to protect him from the violence that defined his existence. This act of betrayal by his father lit a fire within Pedro that could only be extinguished by revenge. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Pedro's moral code, already shaped by a belief in retributive justice, now demanded that he avenge his mother's death in the most brutal way possible. For Pedro, this was not just about killing his father, it was about exacting a punishment so severe that it would send a message to the world about the cost of such betrayal. Pedro's chance for revenge came when his father was imprisoned for the murder. In a macabre twist of fate, Pedro managed to confront his father in the very place where many of his own crimes would later occur behind bars. The encounter was nothing short of horrifying. Pedro attacked his father with a blade, stabbing him repeatedly, a frenzy of violence fueled by years of pent-up rage and pain. But Pedro didn't stop there. In one of the most grotesque acts of his criminal career, Pedro cut out a piece of his father's heart, chewed it, and spat it out. This was not just an act of revenge, it was a symbolic destruction of the man who had caused so much suffering in his life. The act of eating part of his father's heart was more than just a grisly detail. It was Pedro's way of showing that he had completely severed any ties to the man who had destroyed his family. It was an act meant to assert dominance, to show that he had taken control of his life in the only way he knew how, through violence. This moment marked a significant psychological breakdown for Pedro. Any remaining humanity he might have had was further eroded by this act of patricide, pushing him deeper into the mindset of a relentless, remorseless killer. This ultimate betrayal and the subsequent act of revenge did not just sever Pedro's family ties, it severed the last threads of his connection to a normal, moral existence. From this point on, Pedro's killings would become even more brutal and indiscriminate. The psychological toll of his father's crime and his own actions in response drove him further into madness. He became more detached from the world around him, his sense of justice now completely warped by the traumas he had endured and the horrors he had committed. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life after this event was marked by an increasing detachment from reality and an escalation in his violent tendencies. The man who had once seen himself as a vigilante, a dispenser of justice, was now fully consumed by the darkness within him. His story is a chilling reminder of how deep psychological wounds can drive a person to the brink of inhumanity, turning them into the very monster they once sought to destroy. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life took a dark and relentless turn when he was finally captured and imprisoned. However, for a man who had spent his life exacting his own brand of justice, being behind bars did not mean the end of his killing spree. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in his violent career, one that would see him continue his vigilante justice even within the confines of prison walls. Pedro was incarcerated in a notoriously brutal Brazilian prison system where overcrowding, violence, and corruption were rampant. For a man like Pedro, who believed deeply in his self-imposed mission to punish the guilty, prison became a new hunting ground. His targets, fellow inmates whom he deemed guilty of the most heinous crimes, particularly rapists, murderers, and other predators. In Pedro's twisted sense of morality, these men deserved to die, and he saw himself as the one to carry out their sentences. During his time in prison, Pedro is believed to have killed over 40 inmates. His methods were as brutal as they were varied: stabbings, beatings, and even strangulation. Each murder was carried out with a cold, calculated precision that had become his trademark. But Pedro was not indiscriminate in his violence. He chose his victims carefully, focusing on those whose crimes he believed warranted the ultimate punishment. In this way, he continued to see himself as a vigilante, even as he served his own time for murder. Pedro's killings in prison were so frequent and so notorious that they added significantly to his already lengthy sentence. Originally, he had been sentenced to 130 years in prison for the numerous murders he committed before his capture. However, his continued violence behind bars led to this sentence being extended to an astounding 400 years. Despite the severity of these crimes and the extended sentences, Brazilian law capped the maximum time a person could serve in prison at 30 years. This meant that no matter how many people Pedro killed, he would not spend more than 3 decades behind bars, a fact that only fueled his sense of invincibility. Despite his violent actions, Pedro's relationships with other inmates were complex. To some, he was a terrifying figure, a man capable of killing without a second thought. To others, particularly those who saw themselves as victims of the system, Pedro was a twisted kind of hero, a man who did what the authorities could not or would not do. His presence in the prison was both feared and respected, with many inmates understanding that crossing Pedro could mean a death sentence. Pedro's notoriety in prison also meant that he was often left alone by the prison authorities, who either feared him or saw no point in trying to reform a man so deeply entrenched in his violent ways. The guards and administrators, overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners and the violence that pervaded the prison, often turned a blind eye to Pedro's actions, either because they were complicit or simply because they felt powerless to stop him. In this environment, Pedro thrived, continuing to live by his own set of rules and exacting his brand of justice whenever he saw fit. His story within the prison walls is a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained his violent tendencies were and how his sense of morality had been completely warped by his life experiences. Even behind bars, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was a force to be reckoned with, a man who, despite being imprisoned, continued to wield the power of life and death over those around him. This period of Pedro's life solidified his legacy as one of the most infamous killers in Brazil's history, not just for the sheer number of his victims, but for the way he continued to operate under his own moral code, even in the face of imprisonment. His actions in prison were a testament to the psychological damage that had been done throughout his life, driving him to continue his violent ways until the very end. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life took yet another unexpected turn in 2007 when, despite a long history of brutal killings and an extended prison sentence, he was released from prison. Originally sentenced to 130 years and later extended to 400 years due to additional murders committed while incarcerated, Pedro's release seemed unthinkable. However, Brazilian law, which limits the maximum time a person can be imprisoned to 30 years, meant that Pedro could not be held indefinitely, no matter the severity or number of his crimes. After serving just over 3 decades in prison, Pedro walked free, a decision that left many shocked and outraged. His release marked the beginning of a strange and unsettling reinvention. Rather than retreating into obscurity, Pedro embraced his newfound freedom in a way that few could have predicted. He transformed from a feared killer into a social media figure, leveraging the notoriety of his past to build a new public persona. He launched a YouTube channel where he openly discussed his crimes, his experiences in prison, and his views on life and justice. The content was as chilling as it was compelling. Here was a man who had taken dozens of lives, now freely sharing the details of his violent past with the world. Pedro's YouTube channel quickly gained attention. People were drawn to his videos, which offered a first-hand account of a life steeped in violence and vengeance. His candid discussions about his crimes, often delivered with a chilling lack of remorse, fascinated and horrified viewers in equal measure. Pedro presented himself not just as a killer, but as someone who had been shaped by the injustices of his life, a man who had taken on the role of judge, jury, and executioner because, in his mind, the system had failed. The public reaction to Pedro's new life as a free man and online personality was deeply divided. On one hand, there were those who were horrified that a man responsible for so much bloodshed could be released back into society, let alone gain a platform to speak about his crimes. They saw Pedro's YouTube channel as a grotesque celebration of violence, a dangerous glorification of a man who had caused immeasurable pain and suffering. Critics argued that Pedro's presence online could inspire others to take similar paths, viewing him as a twisted sort of anti hero. On the other hand, there were those who were morbidly fascinated by Pedro's story. Some even saw him as a kind of folk hero, a man who had done what the law couldn't or wouldn't do by eliminating some of Brazil's most dangerous criminals. His frank discussions about the failings of the justice system resonated with people who felt similarly disillusioned. For these viewers, Pedro's story was one of survival and twisted justice, a reflection of the harsh realities of life in Brazil's most crime ridden areas. Pedro's YouTube channel also served as a platform for him to attempt to reframe his narrative. He often spoke about his belief in justice, however misguided it may have been, and tried to portray himself as someone who had done what needed to be done in a world full of evil. This narrative, while compelling to some, only deepened the controversy surrounding him. To many, it was clear that Pedro had never truly left behind the mindset that had driven him to kill in the first place. In the end, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's reinvention as a YouTuber added yet another complex layer to his already complicated legacy. His life serves as a stark reminder of the thin line between justice and vengeance and the enduring impact of violence on both the perpetrator and society. Whether seen as a monstrous killer or a vigilante who took justice into his own hands, Pedro's story continues to provoke strong emotions and raise difficult questions about morality, justice, and redemption. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life came to a violent and abrupt end in 2023, a fittingly brutal conclusion to the life of a man who had lived by the sword. Pedro was gunned down by unknown assailants in the city of Mogi das Cruzes in the state of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The details surrounding his assassination remain murky, with the identities and motives of his killers still a mystery. However, what is clear is that Pedro's death was as violent as the life he led, ending in a hail of bullets that left him dead at the age of 68. The circumstances of Pedro's murder are reflective of the dangerous life he had lived, having made countless enemies over the years both inside and outside of prison. Pedro's death seemed almost inevitable. His past actions, particularly his vigilante killings, had made him a target for many who sought revenge. Despite having been released from prison and seemingly starting a new chapter of his life, Pedro could never truly escape the violent world he had once been a part of. The lawless life he led caught up with him in the end, and his assassination was a stark reminder of the cycle of violence that had defined his existence. Pedro Rodrigues Filho leaves behind a legacy that is as controversial as it is complex. On one hand, he is remembered as one of Brazil's most notorious serial killers, a man responsible for the deaths of more than 70 people. His killings were brutal, often carried out with a sense of righteous fury that reflected his deeply warped sense of justice. But on the other hand, Pedro is also remembered by some as a vigilante, a man who took the law into his own hands in a society where the legal system often failed to deliver justice. His story forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the thin line between hero and villain. Pedro's life and actions bear an uncanny resemblance to the fictional character Dexter Morgan, the protagonist of the popular television series Dexter. Like Dexter, Pedro operated under a moral code targeting those he believed deserved to die. However, while Dexter's story is one of fiction, Pedro's is all too real, highlighting the disturbing ways in which reality can mirror fiction. Both characters blur the lines between good and evil, forcing us to question whether a killer can ever truly be justified if their victims are themselves criminals. In the end, Pedro's legacy is one of moral ambiguity. Was he a hero for killing those who had escaped justice, or was he simply another violent criminal who took pleasure in murder? The answer to this question is far from clear, and it is this ambiguity that makes Pedro's story so compelling and so unsettling. As we reflect on Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life, we are left with a series of difficult questions. Can a man who kills be considered a hero if his victims were criminals? Where do we draw the line between justice and vengeance? Pedro's story, like that of Dexter Morgan, challenges our understanding of morality and justice, forcing us to confront the darker aspects of human nature. In the end, Pedro's life serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking the law into one's own hands. While his actions may have been driven by a sense of justice, they ultimately led to a cycle of violence that consumed him and those around him. The story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho is a reminder that the line between hero and villain is often far thinner than we might like to believe.